Good morning. So we are going to learn today regarding reverse charge mechanism. This is also relating to GST as we know. So we'll see regarding this reverse charge mechanism under section 9, subsection 3, 4 and 5. By this we can complete the reverse charge mechanism, and we also see this section's meaning regarding the seller and buyer. If we coming for the part of meaning, as we all know, GST is an indirect tax, and we also know the meaning regarding GST, that is goods and service tax. Here wherever the goods will be delivered or whoever the goods or services will be received, ultimately he has to pay tax of GST, right? So we can also call it as destination based charge or destination based tax. So here the one thing you already know that here usually the seller or the supplier of the goods pay GST to the government, right? As you know, the end customers will not going to pay directly to the government, right? The indirect taxes. As you know, indirect taxes we are having previously so many, but for now we are having GST. We do also know that this custom duties or some of those taxes will not fall under GST, but we do know that here this indirect taxes will not pay by the customers, by the end user directly to the government. So here the person who will be paying is the seller who is selling the goods for us. So this the basic thing we know regarding the indirect taxes, but one thing we should know regarding reverse charge mechanism. That means in some cases where the buyer has to pay tax, the buyer has to take the responsibility, or the buyer has to take the liability of paying tax directly to the government. In what certain conditions where it is applicable, where the buyer is liable to pay the GST. So that sections will discuss under section 9, subsection 3, subsection 4 and subsection 5. So this part of paying tax by the buyer will be called as reverse charge mechanism. So wherever the buyer is liable, not the seller, we are talking about the buyer is liable to pay tax, where the end user is about to pay tax of GST, this process or this mechanism will be calling as reverse charge mechanism. So we will see the first section, that is 9 subsection 3. Right, so we are heading towards section 9 subsection 3. In this, the supplier or the seller, he might be a registered person. We already discussed under section 25 who are the registered persons, and so let it be, but here we'll see that seller is a registered person or he might be an unregistered person. Unregistered persons cannot pay GST, but registered person will pay GST, right? So here the seller or the supplier might be registered or unregistered, but in this the buyer is compulsory a registered person. So section 9 subsection 3 will giving the information regarding here the supplier or seller, he might be a registered or unregistered person, but definitely the buyer will be the registered person. Yes, here buyer is going to pay GST to government. As I told you, reverse charge mechanism, here the buyer is only has to pay tax. On what certain conditions he will pay tax, we're heading towards that. So the section specifying the notified goods and services where the buyer is liable to pay GST. That means whenever this sort of goods or this notified goods or this notified services, if the buyer is availing, in those conditions the buyer has to pay GST to the government, but not the seller. Seller is not collecting GST charges from the buyer. Seller is only collecting the value of the invoice, or I could say the value of the products. So what notified goods and what sort of notified services which is being where the buyer is supposed to pay the GST, that we will see in the next slide. Okay, right, so notified goods and notified services. So if this notified goods or notified services which is being purchased by the buyer, then only he is liable to pay GST. So we'll see notified goods. Some of these are there: cashew nuts and peeled beady wrapped leaves, tobacco leaves, silk yarn, raw cotton, or some of this comes under goods. And if we see the services part, we are having GTA, that is Goods Transport Agency, and the services of advocate, the services of arbitral tribunal to a business entity, director of company he is also giving service, and it's not completely an employee of the company, but he is a service provider and insurance agent, etc. So if this sort of goods and services which been availed by the buyer, then the end user has to pay directly GST amount to the government. And if we want to learn in depth regarding this, of course it is not covered under syllabus, but for us this is enough. What goods and what services which are notified under section 9 subsection 3, right? So we'll go with the section 9 subsection 4, right? So 9(4) is specifying the above section mentioned that here the supplier or seller of the goods or services is unregistered person, but the buyer is registered person. In the previous section also we have seen that buyer is a registered person. Of course buyer will be registered because he has to pay GST under reverse charge mechanism. So here seller is not a registered person, he is an unregistered person, so he definitely won't pay the tax because he is not registered under GST. So who will take the liability of paying tax? Then it is the part of buyer who is going to take the responsibility or liability to pay GST to the government, where the unregistered person supplied taxable items. When he is liable, who is liable? Buyer is liable to pay tax when he is purchasing any item which is coming under taxable items, which is not exempted items, which is not non-taxable items, but those are taxable items purchased by the buyer. In those cases buyer is liable to pay tax. This is one thing you should remember. The other thing is, if the value of goods, if it is above 5,000 rupees, in these cases the buyer has to pay reverse charge mechanism amount to the government, that is we are calling as GST. Here the seller is not paying because he is unregistered, but the buyer is paying. Why? Because he is registered person, right? So he is taking the responsibility of seller to pay GST to the government, but in two conditions. The one thing is the buyer should purchase those items which is coming under taxable GST, taxable items, and the one more thing, that is the bill amount should cross 5,000, then only the buyer is liable to pay GST. Section 9 subsection 5, well, it implies on e-commerce operators. Here they'll have a virtual shops. They don't have any real shops in market, but they are having a virtual shop on the internet where they will supply services. In these cases, this section will going to tell us, it deals with taxability of supply of services, the output tax of which shall be paid by the electronic commerce operator. An example I have given here. Example, in urban clap, if the plumber offer his services to the customer, the tax paid by urban clap operator. A simple example, you could see that urban clap is employing a plumber, right? A plumber is going to give his service to his customer, right? So here customer going to pay the amount to whom? To the plumber, right? So plumber cannot pay GST because plumber is not having a registration under GST. So who will take this responsibility? Yes, it is going to the part of urban clap, that is e-commerce operator. So they are going to pay on behalf of the plumber. So plumber is unregistered, but urban clap is a registered. So the registered person, that is urban clap, is going to pay GST to the government. So this is a reverse charge mechanism. The only three things you should remember, that The basic thing is the buyer is going to pay tax to the government but not the seller. In all cases, in all three sections, buyer is the registered person. And in section 9.3 we have seen that notified goods and services, if these things are availed by the buyer, then he has to pay GST. Section 9.4 implies that whether the seller is a registered or unregistered person, but the buyer is certainly a registered person, where he has to pay GST to the government in two conditions only: if he is availing the taxable items and if those items is crossing about 5,000 rupees. And section 9.5 is telling us that e-commerce operators are going to pay tax on behalf of the unregistered persons who they have been employed.